The border guard at the French-Swiss crossing had seen desperate people before, but the Russian family standing before him in October 1923 carried a desperation that went beyond poverty. The mother clutched 3 children against her worn coat. The father extended a tan booklet across the wooden counter, his hand trembling slightly. The guard opened it, studying the photograph, the physical description, the stamps from previous crossings. At the bottom of the first page, a signature, Fridtjof Nansen, High Commissioner for Refugees. The document was unlike any passport the guard had processed. No national seal, no government ministry, just this strange League of Nations certificate that a dozen countries had agreed to recognize. He hesitated, pen hovering over his stamp. Then he pressed it firmly onto the page. The family crossed into Switzerland, carrying nothing but what they wore and the paper that had given them back their right to exist. How did a polar explorer become the architect of this bureaucratic miracle? Fridtjof Nansen was born on the 10th of October 1861 in Stora Fachen, a rural area near Christiania, Norway. The son of a prosperous lawyer, young Fridtjof spent his childhood skiing through Norwegian forests and developing an obsession with the frozen north. While other boys dreamed of conventional careers, Nansen sketched maps of Greenland and read every Arctic expedition account he could find. His academic path led through zoology and oceanography, but Nansen's restless mind craved more than laboratory work. In 1888, at age 26, he proposed something considered suicidal by experienced explorers, crossing Greenland's ice cap from east to west on skis. Previous expeditions had attempted the journey from west to east, leaving themselves escape routes to populated areas. Nansen deliberately started from the uninhabited east coast, ensuring his team had no choice but to push forward. The strategy worked. His 5-man team became the first to cross Greenland's interior, establishing Nansen as an innovator who thought differently about impossible problems. But Greenland was merely preparation for Nansen's masterpiece of unconventional thinking. Scientists had observed that debris from a shipwreck north of Siberia had drifted with ice currents all the way to Greenland. Nansen proposed building a ship strong enough to survive being frozen into Arctic ice, then deliberately allowing it to drift with the polar current toward the North Pole. The plan seemed insane. Experienced Arctic hands declared it would crush the ship and kill everyone aboard. Nansen designed the Fram, a vessel with a rounded hull that would rise up when squeezed by ice rather than being crushed. In June 1893, the Fram sailed north with Nansen and 12 crew members, entering the ice pack near Siberia. For months, the ship drifted slowly northwest, trapped in ice that groaned and shifted, but never broke the specially designed hull. Realizing the drift wouldn't carry them directly over the pole, Nansen made another audacious decision. In March 1895, he and one companion left the ship with dogs, sledges, and kayaks, attempting to reach the pole on foot. They came closer than any human had reached before turning back, then spent a winter surviving in a stone hut on Franz Josef Land before an extraordinary chance encounter with a British expedition returned them to civilization. Nansen arrived home in August 1896 to discover he had become one of the most famous men in the world. The Fram had survived the ice and returned safely, and Nansen's scientific observations from the expedition revolutionized understanding of Arctic ocean currents. Norway's greatest explorer had proven that impossible problems yielded to innovative thinking and absolute determination. Fame sat uneasily on Nansen's broad shoulders. He accepted a professorship at the University of Christiania, married opera singer Eva Sars, and threw himself into oceanographic research. But the restless energy that had driven him across ice caps couldn't be contained in lecture halls. Nansen needed challenges worthy of his unusual talents. Norway's brewing independence movement provided one. For centuries, Norway had been joined to Sweden under a forced union that left Norwegians governing themselves domestically, but subordinate in foreign affairs. By 1905, the relationship had become untenable. Norway's parliament declared independence, and the nation suddenly needed respected voices to legitimize the separation internationally. Nansen's fame made him invaluable to the independence cause. His scientific reputation and polar achievements had made him known throughout Europe. When Norway needed someone to explain their position to skeptical foreign governments, Nansen became an unofficial ambassador, using his celebrity to open doors that would have remained closed to ordinary diplomats. His efforts helped secure international recognition for Norwegian independence without triggering war with Sweden. The newly independent Norway rewarded Nansen by appointing him their first ambassador to the Court of St. James in London. Nansen accepted reluctantly, finding diplomatic protocol tedious compared to polar exploration. Yet he proved surprisingly effective, his directness and reputation for integrity winning respect in British political circles. He had discovered that his fame could serve purposes beyond personal glory. Nansen's family life suffered under his relentless ambition. Eva bore 5 children, while her husband traveled constantly, chasing new mountains to climb both literal and metaphorical. The marriage grew strained as Nansen's need for achievement pulled him away from domestic contentment. He loved his children, but remained distant, unable to settle into the quiet life his Arctic success had earned him. When World War I erupted in 1914, neutral Norway watched the carnage from the sidelines. Nansen witnessed the unprecedented scale of destruction, the collapse of old empires, the displacement of millions. Something stirred in him as the war dragged on. His polar expeditions had been about personal achievement and scientific advancement. But what if his fame, his diplomatic connections, his talent for solving impossible problems could be turned toward reducing human suffering? The question would soon receive an answer. The League of Nations, struggling to address the humanitarian catastrophe left by the war, would come calling. The explorer who had conquered the Arctic would face his greatest challenge yet, giving identity to people the world had rendered invisible. The Great War ended in November 1918, but the suffering had only begun. Europe's map had been redrawn with brutal indifference to the people living within the new borders. 3 empires, Russian, Ottoman, Austro-Hungarian, had collapsed, taking with them the legal frameworks that had defined citizenship and belonging for millions. In their place rose new nation-states determined to create ethnically homogeneous populations, viewing diversity as a threat rather than a strength. The Russian Revolution had triggered the largest displacement. As the Bolsheviks consolidated power, waves of refugees fled westward, aristocrats who had lost everything, intellectuals targeted for elimination, soldiers from defeated white armies, peasants escaping collectivization. Conservative estimates placed Russian refugees at over 1 million people scattered across Europe and Asia. The Soviet government's response was ruthless. In 1921, Moscow issued a decree stripping citizenship from all Russians living abroad. With a stroke of bureaucratic pen, more than 1 million people became legally non-existent. The Armenian genocide had created another massive refugee population. Ottoman Turkey's systematic extermination campaign had killed over 1 million Armenians and displaced hundreds of thousands more. Survivors scattered across the Middle East and Europe, carrying trauma and little else. Turkey's government showed no interest in allowing returns. The Armenians, like the Russians, found themselves people without a country. Greece and Turkey's bitter conflict produced yet another crisis. As Turkish forces drove Greek armies from Anatolia, hundreds of thousands of ethnic Greeks fled west while Muslims in Greece faced pressure to leave. The population exchanges that would eventually formalize these movements involved over 1 million people forcibly uprooted from ancestral homes, becoming refugees in lands their ancestors had left generations earlier. The human reality behind these statistics was crushing. Former Russian officers worked as taxi drivers in Paris, unable to prove their identities enough to secure proper employment. Armenian families lived in makeshift camps outside Beirut, their children growing up stateless and without education. Greek refugees huddled in abandoned buildings in Athens, legally unable to work in their ethnic homeland because they lacked proper papers. The problem of statelessness revealed a fundamental flaw in how nations conceived of belonging. Citizenship had always been tied to specific countries. Lose your country, lose your legal existence. Without a state to issue identity documents, refugees couldn't prove who they were. Without proof of identity, they couldn't legally cross borders, accept employment, enroll children in schools, or access basic services. They existed in a bureaucratic limbo, worse than imprisonment. At least prisoners had legal status. Existing international law offered no solutions. The Hague Conventions governed warfare but said nothing about displaced civilians. No treaties addressed statelessness. Individual nations could grant asylum, but most countries, exhausted by war and struggling with their own recovery, closed borders to refugees they viewed as burdens. The newly formed League of Nations recognized the crisis, but lacked mechanisms to address it. Member states praised humanitarian principles in speeches while refusing to allocate resources or accept refugees. The League needed someone with stature enough to command attention, diplomatic skill to navigate national interests, and determination to overcome bureaucratic inertia. They needed someone accustomed to solving problems everyone else considered impossible. In February 1921, the League of Nations sent a telegram to Christiania asking if Fridtjof Nansen would serve as High Commissioner for Refugees. The position was temporary, they assured him, focused on repatriating prisoners of war still stranded across Europe 2 years after the armistice. Nansen was 59 years old, comfortably established in his oceanographic research, and under no illusions about international bureaucracy's capacity for inefficiency. He accepted, anyway. Nansen's first challenge seemed straightforward: negotiate with Soviet Russia to return hundreds of thousands of prisoners of war, held in camps across Siberia. The task proved anything but simple. The Bolshevik government, isolated diplomatically and suspicious of Western intentions, refused to cooperate with most League representatives. They agreed to meet with Nansen, drawn by his fame and Norway's neutral status during the war. Nansen traveled to Moscow in September 1921 for direct negotiations with Lenin and other Soviet leaders, where other diplomats brought formal protocols and careful language. Nansen brought Arctic directness. He wasn't interested in ideology or political posturing. He wanted to arrange trains, secure food supplies, and move human beings from camps to homes. The Soviets, accustomed to Western diplomats who lectured them about communism, found Nansen's practical focus refreshing. The negotiations succeeded beyond expectations. Nansen secured agreements to repatriate prisoners through a massive logistical operation involving thousands of train cars, food supplies for the journey, and medical support for the weakest prisoners. The process was complicated by Russia's ongoing famine, which had killed millions. Nansen expanded his mission, organizing food aid to famine regions, while simultaneously managing the repatriation. Between 1921 and 1922, Nansen's operation repatriated 427,000 prisoners of war from 26 countries. He accomplished this with minimal League funding, often financing operations through personal loans and donations he solicited from wealthy supporters. The League praised his success, but refused to provide adequate ongoing support, viewing refugee work as a temporary emergency rather than a sustained commitment. The repatriation work revealed a deeper problem that would define Nansen's remaining years. Many prisoners could be sent home, but what about those who had no home to return to? Russian famigrar couldn't safely return to Soviet territory. Armenians had no Armenia to reclaim. The stateless populations that Nansen encountered daily during his repatriation work represented a crisis that simple logistics couldn't solve. Nansen had approached the Arctic by rejecting conventional wisdom, and he approached the refugee crisis the same way. If these people couldn't return to their countries of origin, and if no countries would accept them without proper documentation, then perhaps the solution wasn't repatriation at all. Perhaps what stateless refugees needed was a different kind of solution entirely, one that acknowledged they might never go home while ensuring they could still live, work, and move freely in their exile. The explorer's mind began working on an impossible problem. How do you give identity to people who have lost their countries? Nansen traveled constantly during 1921 and 1922, visiting refugee camps and settlements across Europe and the Middle East. What he witnessed transformed his understanding of statelessness from an administrative problem into a profound human crisis. In Constantinople, he met former Russian aristocrats living in abandoned warehouses, their children begging in streets while parents sought work that required papers they couldn't obtain. In Athens, Greek refugees from Anatolia crowded into buildings without sanitation, legally barred from employment because they lacked Greek documentation despite their ethnicity. One encounter particularly affected Nansen. A Russian scholar, formerly a professor of mathematics at Moscow University, explained his situation with quiet desperation. He had received a job offer from a university in Prague, but couldn't travel there without valid documents. The Soviet government had stripped his citizenship. No other country would issue him papers. He sat in a cramped room in Berlin, trapped between an impossible past and an inaccessible future. His credentials meant nothing without legal proof of his existence. The stories multiplied in Nansen's notebooks. A former Russian general earned pennies as a taxi driver in Paris, unable to prove his identity well enough to secure military pension he'd earned through decades of service. Armenian families separated across borders had no means to reunite without passports. They couldn't cross into countries where their relatives lived. Children born to stateless parents in refugee camps inherited their parents' legal non-existence, creating a second generation without nationality or rights. The scope of statelessness staggered even Nansen's capacity for large-scale thinking. Conservative estimates placed Russian refugees alone at 1.5 million people scattered across Europe, Asia, and beyond. Armenian refugees numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Greeks expelled from Turkey, Turks expelled from Greece, minorities displaced from newly formed nations. The total count of stateless people exceeded 2 million. Without identity documents, these people existed in a twilight world outside normal legal frameworks. They couldn't legally work, which meant they depended on charity, or worked illegally for exploitative wages. They couldn't travel, which prevented family reunification and economic opportunity. They couldn't marry legally or enroll children in public schools. They had no consular protection when mistreated. They were, in the most literal sense, people without countries, and the international system had no mechanism to address their existence. Nansen observed that stateless refugees possessed everything except the one thing that mattered in a world organized around nation: states, papers proving their right to exist. Many were educated, skilled, and employable. They wanted to work, to rebuild lives, to contribute to societies that hosted them. The barrier wasn't capability, it was documentation. The problem required an innovative solution, the kind Nansen had specialized in throughout his career. In the Arctic, conventional wisdom said you couldn't deliberately freeze a ship in ice and survive. Nansen had built a different kind of ship. Now he needed to create a different kind of document, one that existed outside traditional nationality, yet carried international recognition. The concept would challenge fundamental assumptions about sovereignty and citizenship. Creating it would require convincing dozens of governments to accept something that had never existed before. Nansen began drafting a proposal. If countries wouldn't recognize stateless people as citizens, perhaps they could recognize them as something else. The document Nansen envisioned was revolutionary in its simplicity. A single booklet, issued by the League of Nations rather than any national government, that would identify the bearer as a recognized refugee entitled to travel and work legally. The concept challenged everything nations understood about passports. For centuries, only sovereign states issued travel documents. A passport represented a country's protection of its citizens abroad. What Nansen proposed was a passport without a country, a document that acknowledged its bearer belonged nowhere, while granting them the right to move through the international system anyway. The diplomatic challenge was immense. Nansen needed governments to recognize a travel document they didn't issue, granting legal status to people who weren't their citizens. Many nations viewed the proposal with suspicion. Conservative governments worried that legitimizing refugees would encourage revolutionary movements. Others feared that recognizing refugees' right to travel would create obligations to accept them. Several countries saw Nansen's proposal as an attack on national sovereignty, the fundamental right of states to control who entered and exited their territory. Nansen spent months in grueling negotiations, traveling from capital to capital. He used his fame ruthlessly, securing meetings with heads of state who might have ignored lesser diplomats. In each meeting, he made the same practical argument. These people existed whether governments acknowledged them or not. Giving them legal identity wouldn't increase their numbers. It would simply allow them to work legally, pay taxes, and contribute to societies rather than surviving as invisible burdens on charity or underground economies. France proved crucial to the plan's success. With the largest Russian refugee population in Europe, France had strong practical incentives to find solutions to statelessness. French authorities also recognized that many Russian fémigrés possessed skills their economy needed, if only these refugees could work legally. France's agreement to recognize Nansen's proposed document provided momentum that convinced other nations to follow. On the 5th of July 1922, an intergovernmental conference in Geneva approved the creation of the Nansen passport. The document would be issued to Russian refugees by League of Nations representatives, bearing a photograph, physical description, and Nansen's signature as High Commissioner. Initially, 31 countries agreed to recognize it. The passport would allow its bearer to travel to recognizing countries and, critically, to return to their country of residence, solving the problem that had trapped refugees in place. The first Nansen passports were issued immediately. Within weeks, refugees began experiencing their transformative effect. A Russian fémigré in Paris could accept legal employment instead of working off the books for half wages. An Armenian family in Greece could travel to France, where relatives had settled. A Georgian scholar could accept a university position in Belgium. The passport didn't give them citizenship or a homeland. It gave them something more immediate: the legal right to exist and move within the international system. The document itself was an unremarkable tan booklet with official stamps and identifying information. What made it revolutionary was what it represented. For the first time in history, the international community had created a legal status for people without countries. The Nansen passport acknowledged that statelessness was a reality requiring solutions beyond simply telling refugees to go home. By year's end, 52 governments recognized the Nansen passport. Refugees began calling it simply the Nansen, the paper that restored their place in a world that had tried to erase them. Nansen understood that passports alone wouldn't solve the refugee crisis. Legal identity opened doors, but refugees needed practical support to walk through them. Employment required not just work permits, but often language training and credential recognition. Families scattered across borders needed help reuniting. Refugees living in camps required permanent housing solutions. The Nansen passport was a crucial first step, but Nansen built comprehensive systems around it. In 1922, he established the Nansen International Office for Refugees, operating with minimal league funding supplemented by donations he solicited personally. The office created employment programs that matched refugees with labor shortages in host countries. Russian engineers found work in French factories. Armenian artisans established workshops in Syria. Greek refugees with agricultural backgrounds received land allocations and farming equipment to establish settlements. Nansen's approach was intensely practical. When he learned that France needed workers for reconstruction efforts, he negotiated agreements allowing Russian refugees to fill those positions legally. When he discovered Armenian refugees with no employment prospects in Greece, he arranged their transport to South America, where governments welcomed agricultural labor. He treated refugee resettlement like logistics: identify needs, match resources, move people efficiently. The 1923 population exchange between Greece and Turkey presented Nansen's greatest logistical challenge. The Treaty of Lausanne formalized what violence had begun. Greece and Turkey would exchange populations to create ethnically homogeneous nations. Over 1.5 million people would be forcibly moved: Greeks from Anatolia to Greece, Muslims from Greece to Turkey. Nansen's office coordinated the massive movement, organizing transport, establishing reception camps, and helping refugees transition to their designated countries. Nansen personally inspected refugee settlements, often traveling to remote areas to ensure conditions were adequate. In Syria, he visited Armenian agricultural colonies, checking water supplies and crop yields. In Greece, he toured housing projects built for refugees from Turkey, demanding improvements when standards fell short. His hands-on oversight ensured that programs operated effectively rather than existing only on paper. Financial struggles plagued every initiative. The League of Nations provided token funding while praising Nansen's work in speeches. Member states declined to contribute substantial resources, viewing refugee assistance as temporary charity rather than permanent obligation. Nansen supplemented League budgets through constant fundraising, approaching wealthy individuals and private organizations. He spent his Nobel Prize money on refugee programs. His personal finances suffered as he underwrote operations when other funding failed. Despite resource constraints, the numbers told the success story. By 1925, Nansen's office had helped resettle over 10,000 Armenian refugees in agricultural settlements across Syria, where they established thriving communities. Thousands of Russian refugees in France had transitioned from illegal work to legal employment with proper contracts and protections. Greek refugees from the population exchange, initially homeless and destitute, were moving into permanent housing and establishing businesses. The work expanded beyond Russians, Armenians, and Greeks. Nansen's office assisted Bulgarian refugees displaced by border changes, Turkish minorities fleeing persecution, and other groups caught in Europe's painful territorial readjustments. The Nansen passport system adapted to cover multiple refugee populations, each with unique circumstances, but sharing the fundamental condition of statelessness. Nansen's vision extended beyond emergency relief to permanent integration. He believed refugees should become contributing members of their host societies, not dependent populations living indefinitely on charity. His programs emphasized employment, education, and community establishment, giving refugees tools to rebuild lives rather than just surviving. The humanitarian work that brought Nansen international acclaim extracted a crushing personal price. The suffering he witnessed daily wore through even his legendary resilience. Meetings with desperate refugees, negotiations with indifferent bureaucrats, and constant financial struggles to keep programs operating took their toll. Nansen's health, robust through Arctic expeditions, began failing under the relentless stress of trying to address human misery with insufficient resources. His marriage to Eva finally collapsed under the weight of his absences and single-minded dedication to refugee work. The couple separated in 1919. A private heartbreak Nansen rarely discussed publicly. He had sacrificed family stability to ambitions that never satisfied, always chasing the next challenge. His children saw him infrequently, and when present, he remained emotionally distant, his mind occupied with the next crisis demanding attention. Political opposition to his work grew as some governments began viewing refugee advocacy as interference in domestic affairs. Soviet Russia denounced him for helping famigrar they considered traitors and criminals. Some European governments complained that his efforts encouraged refugees to remain rather than returning home. Conservative factions accused him of enabling revolutionary agitators. Nansen ignored the criticism, focusing on practical results rather than political approval. The League of Nations bureaucracy frustrated Nansen constantly. Member states delivered endless speeches praising humanitarian principles while refusing to allocate meaningful funding. Committees debated policy minutiae, while refugees starved. Nansen's direct, pragmatic approach clashed with diplomatic protocols that valued procedure over outcomes. He repeatedly threatened resignation when League inefficiency blocked urgent initiatives, though he never followed through because abandoning refugees was unthinkable. Yet the accomplishments outweighed the frustrations. By 1930, Over 450,000 Nansen passports had been issued, giving legal identity to people the world had tried to erase. Tens of thousands of refugees had been resettled in stable housing with legal employment. Agricultural settlements Nansen had helped establish were producing crops and supporting self-sufficient communities. Children born stateless were receiving education and opportunities their parents had lost. The numbers represented individual lives saved from desperation and given paths toward dignity. In 1922, the Norwegian Nobel Committee awarded Nansen the Peace Prize for his refugee work. The recognition came with prize money he immediately donated to refugee programs, consistent with his pattern of personal sacrifice for the cause. At the ceremony, Nansen spoke not about his achievements, but about the ongoing need for international cooperation to address displacement. Even in recognition, he deflected attention to the work remaining. Nansen's final years were spent in constant motion, traveling between refugee settlements, league meetings, and fundraising appeals. He drove himself relentlessly, aware that slowing down might mean programs collapsing and refugees losing support. His health declined. Ably colleagues noted his exhaustion, the physical toll of too much travel with too little rest. On May 13, 1930, Fridtjof Nansen died suddenly at his home in Lysaker, Norway. He was 68 years old, still actively managing refugee programs, still seeking solutions to statelessness. International mourning followed as tributes poured in from governments, humanitarian organizations, and refugees whose lives he had transformed. The man who had conquered the Arctic and given identity to the stateless was gone, leaving behind an uncertain question. Would his work continue without him? Nansen's death didn't end his legacy. It unleashed its full potential. The Nansen International Office for Refugees continued operating until 1938, helping millions more displaced people. The Nansen passport remained valid until 1942, with over 450,000 issued total. Among its famous holders were composer Igor Stravinsky, ballerina Anna Pavlova, and writer Vladimir Nabokov. But the vast majority were ordinary people whose names never appeared in newspapers, families who used the document to work, travel, reunite, and rebuild, lives the world had tried to erase. Nansen's innovations became the foundation for modern refugee protection. The 1951 Refugee Convention built directly on principles he pioneered. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, created in 1950, traces its institutional ancestry to his office. Contemporary travel documents for stateless persons operate on his central principle: international recognition of people without countries. Today's crises echo the displacement Nansen confronted: Syrian families, Rohingya people rendered stateless. Climate refugee Saul faced the challenge of legal invisibility he addressed. His insight endures. Human beings deserve identity and protection, regardless of nationality. The explorer who conquered the Arctic became the explorer who mapped paths through humanity's greatest bureaucratic wilderness. Some heroes plant flags on ice caps. Others create documents that restore human dignity. Nansen proved that fame, when paired with determination and compassion, can give millions the most fundamental right, the right to exist. His tan booklet with its careful signature didn't just open borders, it opened futures. And in a world still struggling with displacement, that paper trail of hope continues guiding refugees from invisibility back into the light.